The sound of wood creaking beneath my feet was the only warning before my body partially slid through the attic floor. Hanging there, with one leg swinging into empty space and 130-year-old dust filling my lungs, I had to laugh at the irony. I, Jackson Anderson, a structural engineer who designs million-dollar skyscrapers, was stuck on the rotten floor of the house I'd just bought. 3 months ago, tired of the sterile, soulless apartments I'd lived in for the last 10 years, I did what my colleagues called romantic madness. I invested all my savings in an 1890 Victorian mansion on the east side of Boston. An architectural beauty falling apart that every sensible real estate expert would recommend tearing down. But something about that battered structure spoke to me. If you've ever found yourself completely unprepared to deal with someone who turns your life upside down, hit that like button right now. The first few nights in that house were a mix of enchantment and terror. The floors creaked as if they were talking to me. The arched windows filtered the morning light into hypnotic patterns. And, when it rained, the ceiling leaked in exactly 17 different spots. I counted them all meticulously. That building had personality, unlike the controlled environments I used to design in the office. My routine quickly adapted to the new space. I'd wake up at 6 when the first rays of sunlight pierced through the ragged curtains. I worked remotely from an unstable porch, balancing my laptop on technical manuals to compensate for the tilt of the old table. In the afternoon, I'd try to tackle the most urgent problems with my embarrassingly limited manual skills. At night, I'd wander through the rooms with a flashlight, cataloging every structural flaw like a doctor diagnosing a terminal patient. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with every detail you can imagine are available now. Check out the link in the description right away. The smell of old wood and moldy wallpaper was everywhere. The neighbors, in their impeccably renovated houses, watched me with a mix of curiosity and pity. "The new guy in the Sullivan house," they whispered as I passed by. "Poor guy has no idea what he's gotten himself into." They were right. I really had no idea. That fateful Wednesday, after partially falling through the attic floor, I realized I needed professional help. After freeing myself from the hole and dusting off my century-old clothes, I spent hours researching online until I found a name that kept popping up in reviews for historic home restoration. Zachary Bennett, a specialist in 19th century buildings. I sent a desperate message, expecting a reply by the following week. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. "Zachary Bennett speaking. You got an 1890 Victorian falling apart?" His voice was deep and straight to the point. I explained my situation while watching water trickle down a new crack in the hallway wall. "I can come by tomorrow at 7 to take a look. Looks like your situation is a priority." After hanging up, I felt a momentary sense of relief, never imagining I'd just scheduled an appointment with the man who would transform not only my house, but my entire meticulously structured life. The next morning, right on time at 7, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a man who looked like he had stepped out of a workwear catalog. Tall, probably in his early 30s, with broad shoulders, messy brown hair, and piercing green eyes. His hands were large and visibly calloused, with small scars telling stories of years spent working with tools. "Jackson Anderson?" he asked, extending his hand. His handshake was firm and confident. "Yes, thanks for coming so quickly." "So you're a structural engineer and you bought this bomb waiting to go off?" Zachary asked, already critically examining the ceiling in the entry hall, where a moisture stain had formed a map of some unknown continent. I could feel my face heat up. Ironic, isn't it? I design structures that withstand hurricanes, yet I couldn't see that this house was literally sinking. He smiled, a crooked smile that completely transformed his usually serious face. "Well, doctors get sick too. Let's take a look at this patient." For the next 2 hours, I followed Zachary through every corner of the house. He didn't use any fancy equipment or apps. Instead, he tapped on the walls with his knuckles, listening carefully to the responses. He knelt to examine the baseboards, laid on the floor to check underneath structures, and nimbly climbed the stairs to inspect the roof. The diagnosis was more devastating than my worst estimates. Foundation compromised at least 3 critical points. The electrical system is a fire waiting to happen. The plumbing is melting from the inside, and there's a whole colony of termites throwing a gourmet party in the basement beams. He paused, watching my face turn pale. "But the bones are good. This house wants to live." "The bones?" I repeated, confused. "The original structure. The architectural design. When something is well planned from the beginning, it survives even the worst kind of neglect." He ran his hand along the ornate doorframe. "This lady has personality. It'd be a crime to let her die. The The way he talked about the house, as if it were a living being, caught me off guard. In my work, structures were equations, forces and counterforces, technical drawings, and computer simulations. For Zachary, they were beings with history, character, and a will of their own. How much would it cost to save her? I asked. He did some quick calculations on a worn notepad he pulled from the back pocket of his jeans. Not gonna lie, it's a big project, at least 3 months of intensive work, and it's not gonna be cheap. The number he mentioned made my stomach drop. It was almost all of my remaining savings. But I can cut a bit of cost if you help with some tasks. You know structures better than most of my clients. I have zero practical skills, I confessed. My work is all theoretical and digital. Theory is a good start. You learn the rest. That very afternoon, I signed the contract. Zachary would start the following Monday with a small team. Himself, an electrician, and a plumber he'd worked with for years. The first day of work started with the sound of an old truck pulling up in front of the house at 6:30 in the morning. From the kitchen window, I watched as Zachary unloaded tools with the efficiency of someone who knew the value of every minute. He wore a simple t-shirt that showed off his arm muscles, a result of years of hoisting beams and handling heavy materials. His plan was to start with the most critical, the foundation. During that first week, my remote work routine was completely interrupted by constant noise, ever-present dust, and Zachary's magnetic presence throughout the house. I tried focusing on my projects, but I kept finding myself watching him work, fascinated by the contrast between our approaches to problem solving. At the end of the first week, during an unexpectedly warm autumn evening, Zachary called me down to the basement. I descended reluctantly. That damp, dark space was particularly unpleasant. "I want to show you something," he said, illuminating a section of the original foundation with his flashlight. "See these marks? They're the masons' numbers, the signatures of the builders of this house. They signed off on their work, knowing that almost no one would ever see them." I moved closer, gently touching the symbols carved into the stone. Why would anyone do that? Because they weren't just building a house. They were creating something that would outlive them. A legacy. He switched off the flashlight, leaving only the weak light from the small basement window. "That's why I love restoring, not just renovating. I'm talking to those guys through time." That moment in the basement changed something subtle between us. In the following days, I began to help with small tasks, holding tools, learning how to mix mortar, even trying my hand at hammering, to the great amusement of Zachary, who kindly corrected my terrible technique. During lunch, we started sharing meals on the partially rebuilt porch. Conversation flowed effortlessly between two men who seemed so different. He told fascinating stories about century-old houses he'd restored, the Rhode Island mansion, where he found a diary hidden in a false wall, the little barn in Vermont that turned out to be a stop on the Underground Railroad. In return, I explained the beauty of structural engineering to him, how the very same principles that held up Gothic cathedrals now supported skyscrapers. Surprisingly, he absorbed every concept with genuine interest, asking insightful questions that forced me to reconsider principles I'd long taken for granted. "For someone without formal training in engineering, you understand structural forces incredibly well," I commented one day, impressed by his intuition on a particularly complex roof problem. "I learned by doing. Your equations explain what my hands already know." He smiled that crooked smile which was starting to have a disarming effect on me. We ended up in the same place by different routes. After 3 weeks, the house was beginning to show signs of recovery. The foundation was stabilized, the wiring renewed, and the main floors reinforced. My professional admiration for Zachary grew daily, along with something else I wasn't ready to admit. That was when we discovered the problem in the side tower, an architectural feature that had originally attracted me to the house. What seemed like just a water infiltration issue turned out to be a critical structural failure that threatened to compromise the entire west side of the building. "We need to dismantle that whole section and rebuild from the ground up," explained Zachary, his normally confident face now showing genuine concern. "That's going to add weeks to the schedule and a considerable cost." The news was devastating. We were already at the limit of the budget I'd set aside for the renovation. "How much?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. When he mentioned the number, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was impossible. Every last resource I had was tied up. "Maybe it's time to give up," I muttered, sinking heavily onto a step. "Sell to one of those developers roaming the neighborhood. They'd at least have the capital to—" "No!" The firmness in Zachary's voice surprised me. This house has survived 130 years, Jackson. She deserves another chance. I looked up to meet his intense, determined eyes. But I don't have the money. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as him formulating a plan. What if I take a smaller margin? Work only for the cost of materials for this section. Why would you do that? Because... He hesitated, something rare for someone usually so direct. Because this project has become important to me, more than the others. At that moment, standing on the dusty staircase of a century-old house under reconstruction, something shifted between us. The air seemed to charge with a new and undefinable energy. Zachary was just 2 steps above me, the afternoon light filtering through the window, illuminating dust particles between us like tiny stars. Zachary, I can't, I started. You can. Think of it as an investment in my professional satisfaction. He stepped down a step, closing the gap between us. And maybe, in something more. My heart raced in a way that no structural equation could explain. For the first time since I'd met him, Zachary seemed slightly uncertain too, as if he too were in uncharted territory. Before I could respond, the shrill sound of a phone broke the moment. It was the electrician calling about an urgent issue with the electrical panel. Zachary answered, and the moment dissolved like dust in the air. That night, alone in my partially renovated room, I lay awake for hours, replaying that moment on the stairs, analyzing every word and every look. As an engineer, I had always trusted concrete data and measurable facts, but what was happening between Zachary and me defied any attempt at quantification or rational analysis. The house creaked around me, as if it too were restless, processing its own deep transformations. For the first time, I understood why Zachary talked about it like it was alive. We were both being rebuilt, facing our own compromised foundations and hidden structural flaws. And the scariest part, I had no blueprint or manual for this kind of renovation. 3 days after the conversation on the stairs, we finalized the deal to save the tower. Zachary would take a smaller profit margin, and I would contribute more hours of manual labor to compensate. The new arrangement meant we'd spend even more time together, often alone while the rest of the crew focused on other parts of the house. One particularly hot afternoon, we were working on removing the damaged boards from the tower. The space was tight, forcing us into an intimacy that made it impossible to ignore the growing tension between us. Every time our hands accidentally brushed, I felt an electric current more powerful than any wiring problem we'd fixed in the house. "Hand me that crowbar," Zachary said, focused on prying off a particularly stubborn board. When I handed over the tool, our fingers touched a second longer than necessary. His eyes lifted to mine, and something in that look made my stomach leap in a way no structural failure ever could. "Jackson," his voice was huskier than usual. "We need to talk about what's happening between us." I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the sweat on my back, the smell of old wood and dust dancing in the sunbeams that filtered through the gaps in the tower. "Are you talking about the water leak problem?" I tried to deflect, fully knowing that wasn't what he meant. Zachary set the crowbar down and came closer, erasing the safe space between us. Without his tools, his hands seemed momentarily uncertain, until one of them hesitantly reached up to brush my face. "You know I'm not talking about the house," he replied, his voice low and intense. "This structure between us wasn't in the original plans." The touch of his hand was surprisingly gentle for someone who spent his days hefting heavy materials. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting myself feel the texture of his skin against mine, calloused in the right places, rough in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated, my voice nearly a whisper. "I don't know how to handle this. There's no manual for it." A slow smile spread across his lips. "Some things don't need a manual, Jackson. Just instinct." The space between us disappeared when his lips met mine. The first sensation was sheer surprise, not because of the act itself, which had felt inevitable for days, but because of the initial gentleness of the contact. Like a careful builder testing the stability of a structure before applying weight. Zachary began with a light, almost respectful pressure. I responded instinctively, my hands finding his shoulders, feeling the strength of his muscles under the dusted t-shirt. The kiss deepened, growing in intensity, until my knees nearly buckled. I leaned back until the newly reinforced wall pressed against my back, grateful for its stability, while my inner world seemed to both collapse and rebuild itself at the same time. Zachary's hands found my waist, holding me firmly enough to convey desire, but gently enough to let me choose the next move. The kiss tasted like breakfast and old wood dust, a strangely intoxicating combination that made me want more. A loud noise from the first floor abruptly separated us. Probably the plumber knocking something over in the kitchen. Panting, we pulled apart just enough to look into each other's eyes, our hands still lingering as if afraid the connection might vanish if we let go completely. That was... I began, unable to find the right words. How long have you wanted to do that? Zachary asked, his voice rougher than before. Ever since you hit that beam in the attic and explained how the wood talks to you, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. His laugh resonated between us, creating an intimacy that felt both new and strangely familiar. And I've been watching you try to hammer that nail during the first week. I've never seen someone so brilliant be so utterly terrible with a hammer. Now, it was my turn to laugh, the tension easing into something more comfortable, more promising. We don't have much time now, he said, hearing footsteps coming up the stairs. But I want to continue this structural inspection later, if you're up for it. I nodded, too breathless to form coherent words, while his thumb absent-mindedly traced circles on my wrist, sending little shocks through my system. Dinner tonight? At my apartment? He suggested, already starting to move away as the footsteps neared. I promise no nails and screws on the menu. Yes, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, I do. Zachary's apartment was exactly as I'd imagined. A spacious loft in a converted old warehouse with exposed beams, brick walls, and furniture he'd built himself from materials reclaimed from previous projects. The dining table, he explained while pouring wine into simple glasses, was made from wood salvaged from an 1850 barn he had restored the previous year. Every piece has its own story, I commented, running my fingers over the perfectly sanded surface. Just like every person, he replied, his eyes never leaving mine as he set the plates on the table. Dinner was surprisingly homey, a rich stew that had been slowly cooking throughout the day, served with rustic bread still warm from the oven. I never imagined you could cook, I admitted between bites. Restoring houses and cooking aren't so different. Both require patience, attention to detail, and respect for the materials. He sipped his wine. Besides, I grew up helping my grandmother in the kitchen, while my grandfather taught me carpentry in the garage. Both skills came as a package. The conversation flowed naturally, without the tension I expected after our moment in the tower. We talked about our families, our first jobs, our favorite books. I learned that Zachary started working as a general helper at 16, funding his own night classes to learn design and construction techniques. I never finished college formally, he explained, but I learned from master craftsmen who'd been doing this work for generations. That explains why you treat houses with so much respect, I observed. You learned the trade the old-fashioned way. And you? How does a brilliant engineer end up so fascinated by a crumbling house? He asked. I smiled, contemplating the question. I guess I spent so much time designing perfect structures that I forgot about the beauty and imperfection. This house, it has character, scars, history, all the things I consciously left out of my own designs. Zachary reached across the table, and our fingers interlaced naturally. Imperfections are where the light comes in, you know? That's what makes something unique. Dinner was soon forgotten as we moved to the couch, the wine and conversation creating an intimacy that made every touch even more meaningful. When Zachary leaned in to kiss me again, there was no urgency like before in the tower. Instead, there was a deliberate exploration, as if he were memorizing every sensation. His hands, which I'd seen working with precision on delicate finishing details of the house, now touched me with the same dedicated focus, discovering which gestures elicited which responses. My shirt was slowly unbuttoned, every inch of skin exposed receiving its own attention. Do you work with that much patience on all your projects? I managed to ask between broken breaths as his lips found my neck. I felt his smile against my skin. Only on the things that really matter. The loft was quiet, except for our breathing, and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above us, as if the building itself were responding to our movements. When his t-shirt came off, I let my hands explore the well-defined muscles shaped by years of physical work. So different from my own body, molded by long hours at a computer designing. Every touch was like drawing a new blueprint, discovering the underlying structure that made Zachary who he was. The small scars on his forearms told stories of past projects. The light tan halfway up his biceps marked the spot where his sleeves were usually rolled up. "You're analyzing me, engineer?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he watched me study him. "I'm appreciating the design," I replied, feeling a new confidence arise. Impeccable in every way. Then he pulled me closer, erasing any space between us. The weight of his body against mine felt grounding. like a solid foundation beneath a structure that had finally found its perfect balance. His kisses grew deeper, more urgent, and I surrendered completely to the sensation. That night, in Zachary's arms, I felt simultaneously deconstructed and rebuilt. Like an old house being restored, layers of carefully built protection, assembled over the years, were gently stripped away, revealing the original structure underneath, vulnerable, but infinitely more genuine. His fingers worked with the same precision he displayed when restoring ornate details in the house, finding pleasure points I never knew existed. When we finally became one completely, it was as though two separate structures had found a perfect harmony, every angle fitting exactly where it should, every movement constructing something new and surprisingly strong. At the climax, I gripped his shoulders like they were the only sturdy thing in a suddenly unstable world. He whispered my name like a prayer, his husky voice full of contained emotion, and I felt something collapse inside me. Not in a destructive way, but liberating, like an unnecessary wall being torn down to reveal a larger, light-filled space. Morning light streamed in through the great windows of the loft, casting geometric patterns onto the polished wooden floor. I woke slowly, aware of the weight of Zachary's arm around me, of the steady rise and fall of his chest against my back. For a moment, I just watched the dust dancing in the sunbeams, trying to process the transformation of the night before. As an engineer, I was used to planning every detail, calculating every variable before acting. But with Zachary, I'd allowed myself simply to feel, to react, to exist in the moment without overanalyzing its structural implications. "I can hear your mind working over there," he murmured sleepily, his lips brushing my bare shoulder. "Already calculating tension angles at 7 in the morning?" I smiled, turning to face him. His hair was tousled, a scruffy beard shadowed his chin, and yet, I'd never seen anyone so perfectly put together. "Actually, I was thinking about how some things just can't be calculated," I responded. "Like this." "Like this?" His fingers lazily traced my collarbone, sending shivers along my skin. What happened last night, what it means." He sighed, pulling me even closer. Always the analyst. "Not everything needs to be defined right away, you know? Some structures evolve organically over time. Easy for you to say. You deal with improvisation every day. I work with detailed plans and tension simulations." Zachary laughed, the sound resonating from his chest against mine. "Want a tension simulation? Try restoring a Victorian mansion on a tight budget and impossible deadlines." I joined in his laughter, letting the tension dissipate. He was right, of course. Some things couldn't be planned or calculated. They had to be experienced, adapted, and lived. We stayed in bed much longer than we probably should have, knowing full well we should be at the construction site by 8. When we finally left our separate ways for the house, so as not to alert the other workers, we exchanged looks filled with meaning as we resumed our professional roles. In the following weeks, we developed a routine that blended work with personal discovery. By day, we restored the house side by side, me gradually learning to understand materials with my hands instead of just equations, him absorbing my technical knowledge about force distribution and structural resistance. At night, we explored each other with the same meticulous dedication we applied to the restoration. Whether in his loft or my partially refurbished room, we built something that, like the house, seemed both fragile and extraordinarily strong. "You're getting good at this," Zachary commented one afternoon, watching me apply mortar between the old chimney bricks with my newly acquired precision. "I had a good teacher," I replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with physical work. When we leaned in for a quick kiss, hidden from the view of the other workers behind the chimney structure, I felt a security I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I was building something without detailed blueprints or prior calculations, and the outcome, though unpredictable, felt stronger than any structure I'd ever designed. That night, lying in my bed after hours of exploring each other, Zachary traced invisible patterns on my chest while I watched the shadows dance on the freshly painted ceiling. "The tower is almost done," he remarked casually, as if discussing the weather. Something in the way he said it put me on alert. "Yeah, one more week and it'll be completely restored. The entire house is progressing faster than expected. Maybe another month and we'll be finished with the whole project." I felt a tightening in my chest that no equation could explain. The completion of the renovation, which once was my most urgent goal, now represented a question mark I wasn't ready to face. "And after?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Zachary fell silent for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, he took a deep breath. I got an offer yesterday. A restoration project in Colorado. An old railroad station being turned into a cultural center. The air suddenly felt heavy, hard to breathe. Colorado, I repeated in disbelief. 6 months of work at least, he continued, his hand now steady on my heart. One of the most important projects of my career. I forced myself to swallow the lump forming in my throat. When? 2 weeks after we wrap up here. I tried to process the information as I would a complex structural problem, breaking it into manageable parts, analyzing each aspect individually. But my analytical mind completely failed, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion that I couldn't compartmentalize. It's a great opportunity, I managed to say, my voice sounding strangely distant even to my own ears. Jackson. He rested his elbow so that he could look me directly in the eyes. I haven't accepted it yet. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But you will. You have to. It's the kind of project you've always dreamed about. His green eyes studied me as intently as I examined damaged structures for hidden weaknesses. And what about us? This structure we're building? The question hung between us like dust in the air, impossible to ignore yet hard to grasp. I wanted to say so many things, that I'd never felt as alive as these past few weeks. That the thought of him leaving made my chest ache in a very real way. That maybe we could find a solution that didn't involve parting ways. But the words stayed stuck, like jammed beams that refused to align. Fear, uncertainty, the newness of it all. They formed a barrier my voice couldn't break through. You have to go, I finally said, my voice more determined than I expected. It's an amazing opportunity. You can't turn it down for something so recent and undefined. Something in Zachary's eyes dimmed, as if a light was gradually being turned off. He didn't argue, didn't push back. He only slowly nodded, accepting my answer for what it was. Not a direct rejection, but an inability to offer an alternative strong enough to compete with the certainty of a significant professional opportunity. That night, we made love with an intensity that almost hurt, as if we were trying to etch the feeling of each other into our memories. Every touch carried the weight of our limited time. Every kiss savored as if it were precious and finite. Later, as he slept, I watched the moonlight cast shadows through the thin curtains, highlighting the contours of his relaxed face in slumber. Structures, after all, are not permanent. Even the sturdiest eventually yield to time, circumstances, the choices we make or fail to make. The house creaked softly around us, its century-old bones settling, adapting to the changes we had introduced into its ancient frame. Like the house, I was being transformed, strengthened, stabilized, restored. Yet unlike the house, my emotional foundations still weren't ready to bear the weight of what Zachary was silently offering me. And that realization, more than anything else, made me feel like the most fragile structure in that entire house. The following days passed in a frenzied rhythm of work, as if we both tried to lose ourselves in the details of the restoration to avoid the pending conversation between us. The tower was nearly finished, its elegant lines restored to their original glory. The roof no longer leaked. The wiring was secure. The floors didn't creak, at least not dangerously. During our nights together, there was a new urgency, a silent desperation neither of us mentioned. An invisible countdown hovered over every shared moment. A week before the projected completion of the work, Zachary and I were working alone installing the last wooden panels in the library, a room we had converted into what would be my future home office. The silence between us was only broken by the rhythmic sound of hammers and the occasional request for tools. "Have you confirmed the departure date for Colorado?" I finally asked, trying to keep my tone casual as I measured a plank. Zachary paused, his hands holding a manual saw suspended in the air for a moment before he finished the cut. "Yes, the 12th. Early morning flight. 10 days. That was all we had left." "The guest room in that railroad station must be stunning," I commented, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He didn't answer immediately, focusing on aligning the panel he was installing perfectly. Only after he secured it precisely did he turn to me. "You know, Jackson, you're not making this any easier." "Making what easier?" "Pretending that we don't have choices here." My hammer paused mid-swing. "You do have a choice, Zachary, and you're making the right one. It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance. I'm not talking just about me." His voice took on an intensity that finally forced me to look at him. "I'm talking about the two of us, about possibilities." "What possibilities?" I asked, my heart racing against my will. "You in Colorado, me here? Long-distance relationships rarely—" "Come with me," he interrupted, his words spilling out in a rush as if he were afraid to lose courage if he hesitated. Work remotely for a while. You said your boss already agreed to it for the renovation. Why not extend? The suggestion hit me like a bucket of cold water. Not because it was absurd, but because it was exactly what I secretly both desired and feared. I can't just leave everything behind. Why not? What exactly is holding you so tight? A job you do perfectly well from anywhere with internet? This house that is now practically finished? His questions hit the precise weak points of my resistance, like an experienced builder who knows exactly where a structure can fail. It's not that simple, I argued, even as every word made my argument sound increasingly hollow. I have responsibilities, clients. This house represents a huge investment. Responsibilities with whom? With what? Zachary put down his tools and stepped closer, his frustration almost tangible. Jackson, I'm asking for 2 months. Just come for 2 months. See if it works. If it doesn't, you go back to your perfectly organized life here. The proposal hung between us, concrete and scary in its simplicity. 2 months. 60 days to risk everything I knew for something undefinable and unpredictable. And if it doesn't work? The question that truly tormented me finally slipped out. Zachary's expression softened, the frustration giving way to understanding that completely disarmed me. Is that what you're afraid of? That we might discover that what we have isn't strong enough? He gestured between us. The worst-case scenario is that you get a long vacation in Colorado and a good story to tell. The best-case scenario, he trailed off, his eyes locked on mine, conveying more than words ever could. I need time to think, I finally replied, feeling the weight of the decision in every cell of my body. Zachary nodded, respecting my hesitation, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Sure, just don't take too long. Some structures can't stay suspended forever without proper support. We returned to our work, the silence between us now charged with unexplored possibilities and unspoken fears. That night, alone in my room, I walked through the almost restored house. Every room told a story of transformation, from decay to rebirth. I stopped by the tower, now beautifully rebuilt, remembering how close it had come to collapsing just weeks before. I recalled the moment of our first kiss there, how my world had changed in a matter of seconds. Since then, I had transformed just as much as the house, learning skills I never imagined I could have, uncovering parts of myself I didn't even know existed, all because of Zachary Bennett, the man who understood damaged structures and knew how to make them strong again. I spent the following week in a state of inner turbulence, endlessly weighing the pros and cons of a decision that, deep down, couldn't be reduced to a simple cost-benefit spreadsheet. By day, we worked side by side, finishing the last details of the house. At night, we loved each other with an intensity born of uncertainty, neither of us mentioning the elephant in the room, my lack of an answer to his proposal. On the final official day of the renovation, we gathered all the workers for a small celebration. Cold beer, pizza, and a general sense of pride over what we had collectively accomplished. The house, once on the brink of collapse, now displayed the elegance and strength its original builders had envisioned. In the midst of the celebrations, I noticed Zachary walking away silently toward the porch. I followed him and found him leaning on the newly restored railing, gazing at the sunset. "We're even now," he said when he heard me approach. "The house is saved. Mission accomplished." I stood beside him, our arms nearly touching. "You did more than save the structure. You brought its soul back. Some restorations are more gratifying than others." He turned to me, his eyes reflecting the orange hues of the twilight sky. This one was special on many levels. A silence settled between us, filled only by the distant sounds of celebration echoing from inside the house, and the occasional traffic noise outside. "You leave the day after tomorrow," I observed finally, stating the obvious. "Yes, flight at 7:20. More silence. The tension between us was almost tangible, loaded with questions left unsaid and answers never given. "Jackson," he began hesitantly for the first time since I'd met him, "my invitation still stands. 2 months, no commitments beyond that, just an exploration." I felt my heart race, the internal battle between safety and risk at its peak. "Zachary, my words seemed inadequate, insufficient to express the turmoil inside me. Before I could continue, he gently raised his hand. "There's no need to answer right now. In fact, maybe it's better if you don't. Just, if you decide to come, my flight is American Airlines 4436. If not," he shrugged, trying to sound casual even though his eyes betrayed how important this moment was. Well, you'll have one hell of a house to enjoy. Our final kiss on the porch was bittersweet, laden with the weight of unfulfilled possibilities and choices yet to be made. When he left that night, taking his last tools with him, and leaving behind only the sawdust and memories, I felt as if part of the house, or maybe a part of me, was leaving along with him. The next morning, I woke up with the strange sensation of being in a house that was at once familiar and foreign. Barefoot, I walked down the corridors, touching the walls that we had restored together. Every board, every bit of trim, every polished hinge held fragments of our shared story. In my little office, I tried to work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Zachary and his offer. I opened a new spreadsheet, trying to do what I always did when faced with a difficult decision: convert feelings into numbers, emotions into predictable formulas. Pros of going: adventure, time with Zachary, expanded professional experience, the possibility of finding something lasting. Cons: instability, uncertainty, significant professional risk, significant emotional risk. I stared at that pathetic list for long minutes, gradually realizing its complete inadequacy. Some decisions couldn't be boiled down into columns of pros and cons. Some structures couldn't be fully calculated before they were built. Sometimes, as Zachary had taught me, you have to trust your instinct, the materials, and the process. That night was the longest of my life. Lying in the perfectly restored bed, in the impeccably painted room, in the perfectly sturdy house, I felt strangely empty. "You built walls that no one could beat," I murmured to the ceiling. "But you never learned anything about tearing down the emotional walls." The house answered with its understanding silence, its creaks now comforting instead of alarming. At 4:30 in the morning, still awake, I made a decision. I got up, took a quick shower, and started throwing clothes haphazardly into a suitcase. No spreadsheets, no lists, no detailed plan, just pure, instinctive movement. In the taxi on the way to the airport, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure the driver could hear it. By 6:45, I was in line for check-in, mentally rehearsing what I'd say when I saw Zachary. At 7, I found myself standing in the terminal, watching passengers board American Airlines Flight 4436 to Denver. I looked frantically for that familiar figure. Broad shoulders, messy hair, that confident gait. "Final call for American Airlines Flight 4436 to Denver," announced the metallic voice over the PA system. "All passengers, please proceed immediately to the boarding gate." My heart sank. Had he changed flights? Given up on the job offer? Or simply decided that I wasn't worth the wait? The boarding line was thinning rapidly. In a few minutes the doors would close, and with them, perhaps, my only chance to find out what we could build together. "Excuse me," I said to the attendant at the counter, in an impulsive move completely out of character for me. "Is it still possible to buy a ticket for this flight?" 2 months later, I'm sitting on the restored porch of an old railroad station in Colorado, watching the Rocky Mountains bathed in the glow of sunset. The air here is different, lighter, cleaner, imbued with the scent of pine and possibility. The project is nearly finished, the station transformed into an impressive cultural center that will keep the region's railroad history alive. I worked remotely during this period, alternating between my engineering projects and helping Zachary with the restoration details. I discovered that my manual skills had improved significantly. I can now hammer a nail without damaging nearby structures. I glance at the empty chair next to me, where in a few minutes Zachary will join me with 2 cold beers for our end-of-day ritual. Our routine here has developed naturally, as if our lives were designed to interlock from the start. I still remember the look on his face when he saw me running through the terminal that morning. He had been there all along, in the food court, sipping coffee, nearly missing his flight while waiting until the last minute for someone he didn't really believe would show up. "You came," he said simply, the most genuine smile I'd ever seen lighting up his face. "Some structures are worth saving," I replied, out of breath from the run. Now, 2 months later, I face a new decision. The project is wrapping up. So is my extended leave from Boston. Zachary has already received offers for new projects, some nearby, others far away. We continue to avoid talking about the future, savoring each day as if it were an unexpected gift. But time marches on, and decisions are looming. I hear his familiar footsteps on the porch stairs and smile even before I see him. He appears carrying 2 local beer bottles and an envelope. "Mail for you," he says, as he hands over the envelope before sitting down. Looks official. I examine the envelope, emblazoned with my Boston company's logo. Probably some administrative paperwork my boss mentioned during last week's video conference. You can wait, I say, setting it aside and accepting the offered beer. How did the final electrical installation go? Perfect. The original system was a complete mess, but we managed to preserve the decorative light fixtures while modernizing all of the wiring. He takes a sip of beer, gazing at the horizon. The place is going to look beautiful when everything lights up for the inauguration next week. We drink in comfortable silence for a few minutes, contemplating the mountains that still seem almost unreal in their grandeur. So different from the Boston skyscrapers. I got an offer today, Zachary finally says, his voice carefully neutral. A mansion in Santa Fe, originally from the 1880s, in critical condition, but with incredible potential. My heart skipped an involuntary beat. Santa Fe, even farther from Boston. Another step away from the life I'd known for so long. For how long, I ask, keeping my voice calm. 8 months at least, maybe more. He glances sideways at me, assessing my reaction. They'd start in 3 weeks. I take another sip of beer, letting the information settle. 2 months ago, this news would have triggered a storm of anxiety. Spreadsheets of analysis, meticulously weighed pros and cons. Today, it only prompts one question. Is the climate in Santa Fe good for remote work? A slow smile spread across Zachary's face, lighting up his eyes before it spread elsewhere. They say it's excellent, almost year-round sunshine. Great internet in the part of town where the mansion is. I nod, contemplating my beer for a moment before returning my gaze to him. Seems like we need to find a good real estate agent then. It doesn't make sense to keep renting if we're going to be here for that long. It wasn't a formal commitment or a grand declaration. It was just the next logical step, a decision to continue building on the foundation we had laid in these 2 months. Zachary placed his hand on mine on the arm of the chair, his calloused fingers conveying more than words possibly could. You know, he said after a pause, when I started working on your house in Boston, I thought I was just fixing up another dilapidated structure, and ended up breaking my heart in the process, I finished, smiling to soften the words. He squeezed my hand gently. I'd prefer to think that I just knocked down the unnecessary walls to reveal the open space that always should have been there. I looked out at the majestic mountains ahead, then back at our intertwined hands, and finally at the man beside me. A man who understood, like few others, that sometimes you have to completely dismantle one structure to rebuild it stronger. You know what's ironic? I observed. I spent my entire career calculating exactly how much weight a structure can bear. And then you came along and taught me that some of the strongest structures are the ones we build without a manual. The century-old railroad station creaked softly around us, its ancient bones silent witnesses to arrivals and departures, to endings and beginnings. Like my house in Boston, it got a second chance. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with every detail you can imagine are available now. Check out the link in the description right away. If you've ever let someone tear down the walls you built around yourself only to create something more beautiful and stronger, hit like and share your own story of personal renovation in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about unexpected encounters that transform our foundations forever. Because sometimes, the best projects in our lives are the ones we never planned.